Sophia Ramirez stepped onto the obstacle course at Fort Brennan with her carbon fiber prosthetic gleaming in the Georgia sun. The hushed whispers of the other officer candidates cut through the humid air as she adjusted her tactical gear and surveyed the imposing training grounds that would determine her future. This was it. The Advanced Combat Leadership Program, the most grueling officer training in the military, and a course infamous for breaking candidates with two good legs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The other candidates moved with confident strides, their regulation boots hitting the ground in perfect rhythm. Sophia watched them compare notes about the upcoming physical trials, their bodies whole and uncompromised by war. Her own body transformed by an IED explosion in Kandahar 3 years earlier, felt suddenly conspicuous as she ran through her mental preparation. The prosthetic that had become an extension of herself now felt like a beacon announcing her difference. "Who brings a spare part to combat training?" muttered James Westfield, a legacy recruit whose father was a decorated general. His deep Southern drawl carried across the formation line. "Hey Hopper, you sure you're in the right place?" Sophia didn't respond. She'd learned during rehabilitation that silence was often the strongest statement. Instead, she pulled out her custom-designed fitness journal, pages filled with adapted exercise techniques and progressive training logs she'd been perfecting during the 18 months since the doctors cleared her for active duty. While others boasted about their college athletics backgrounds, she quietly studied the first obstacle, a 30-foot rope climb that would challenge her prosthetic's grip strength in ways the designers never anticipated. Major Rivera, the lead instructor, barely glanced at her during roll call. When he reached her name, he paused as if surprised to find it on his clipboard. "Ramirez, medical waiver?" he asked, his eyebrows furrowing as he looked up. "No, sir." "Full qualification," Sophia replied firmly, her spine straightening to its full height. Rivera looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on the carbon fiber attachment where her left leg should have been. His expression shifted from confusion to something closer to pity. "Right," he said, his tone suggesting disbelief. "We'll see." The first day's briefing made one thing crystal clear. Physical dominance was everything at Fort Brennan. The training center's unofficial motto was painted on the obstacle course entrance: "Victory through superiority." Everything Sophia had learned about adaptation and alternative approaches seemed suddenly invalidated as Major Rivera outlined the competition-based advancement system. During equipment check, Sergeant Torres, the physical training specialist, stopped at Sophia's prosthetic. He crouched down to examine it with a frown that suggested he was inspecting a liability rather than advanced military-grade technology. "This thing even approved for this course?" he asked, earning snickers from the watching candidates. "Yes, sir. Titanium core with carbon fiber shell. Military performance rated by Walter Reed. I've completed 3 marathons with it," Sophia replied, her voice neutral despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "3 marathons," Torres repeated, looking unconvinced. "How long ago did you lose it?" 3 years, 2 months, sir." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken judgment. Most candidates were peak physical specimens directly from elite universities or combat units. Sophia had spent those years learning to walk again, then run, then fight, achievements that suddenly seemed insignificant in this environment. That evening, as she organized her gear in the barracks, Sophia overheard Westfield talking to his growing circle of admirers. $20 says Hopper doesn't make it past the first elimination round," he said loudly. "She's probably here because someone in Washington wanted a feel-good diversity story." The nickname spread through the barracks like wildfire. Hopper. By the end of the first week, even some of the junior instructors were using it behind her back. Sophia endured it all with the same quiet determination that had gotten her through. 18 surgeries and countless hours of rehabilitation. She focused instead on studying the obstacle course layouts and preparing alternative techniques for each challenge. She had no way of knowing that in just a few weeks, that same determination would be the difference between life and death for a visiting Medal of Honor recipient, and that the prosthetic leg they all mocked would prove that sometimes adaptation beats perfection when everything is on the line. But first, she had to survive being the misfit who everyone had already dismissed as too broken to matter. The first elimination challenge loomed before them like a battlefield, architect's nightmare, a 10-station combat course designed to push even elite soldiers to their physical limits. The morning sun cast long shadows across the apparatus as 50 candidates lined up in their assigned lanes. "Candidates, this is an elimination event," Major Rivera announced through the bullhorn. "The bottom 10 performers will be removed from the program today. Physical superiority is non-negotiable." In combat leadership, Sophia adjusted her prosthetic, double-checking the settings she'd calibrated for maximum stability. Around her, the other candidates stretched and jumped in place, their unmodified bodies responding with natural fluidity that her left leg would never again possess. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The whistle blew, and James Westfield exploded from the starting line. His athletic frame cleared the first 3 obstacles with textbook perfection, putting him immediately at the front of the pack. Sophia started methodically, conserving energy where others spent it freely, calculating each movement to maximize efficiency with her prosthetic. The wall climb came first, a 15-foot vertical barrier that most candidates attacked with explosive jumps and upper body strength. Sophia had developed a different technique, using her right leg's power combined with specialized grips on her prosthetic's foot. She climbed steadily, reaching the top just as some of the middling performers were dropping to the other side. Next came the monkey bars spanning a mud pit, a challenge for balance that highlighted every difference in her gait. While others swung across with symmetrical momentum, Sophia had to compensate for the prosthetic's different weight distribution, making her progress noticeably different, though not necessarily slower. The real challenge came at the rope descent into a water hazard. Most candidates could control their descent with both legs, creating friction against the rope. Sophia had to rely almost entirely on upper body strength, burning precious energy that she'd need for later obstacles. She hit the water with a splash that felt like defeat, watching as several more candidates pulled ahead. By the 7th obstacle, a crawl beneath barbed wire through thick mud, Sophia's specialized prosthetic sleeve was failing. Mud had worked its way into the sensitive connection point between flesh and carbon fiber, creating painful friction with every movement. Where others faced mere discomfort, she battled genuine pain that threatened her consciousness. Westfield was already finishing as Sophia tackled the final obstacle, a 40-foot rope climb. Her arms trembled with fatigue, the culmination of compensating for her prosthetic through 9 previous challenges. The rope swayed as she pulled herself upward, one excruciating foot at a time, her vision narrowing to the single point of the bell at the top. "Time," Major Rivera called as Sophia's hand finally struck the bell. She slid down the rope, landing awkwardly as her prosthetic shifted under her weight. The results were posted immediately on the digital leaderboard. James Westfield had finished first, setting a course record. Sophia's name appeared in 38th position, safe from elimination but nowhere near competitive. The bottom 10 candidates received their dismissal orders on the spot. Their dreams of officer leadership ended in a single morning of failure. "Ramirez," Major Rivera called as the group dispersed. A moment. Sophia approached, limping slightly, as the prosthetic socket rubbed against raw skin. She stood at attention despite the pain, refusing to show weakness. "You're clearing the minimum benchmarks," Rivera said, his tone conversational rather than congratulatory. But leadership isn't about meeting minimums. The standards exist for a reason. This program identifies those with the physical capabilities to lead in combat environments. Yes, sir. I understand the standards. Rivera studied her face, looking for something, perhaps doubt or resignation. There's no shame in recognizing one's limitations, Ramirez. The military needs talented people in many capacities. The suggestion was clear, though never explicitly stated. Drop out now before further humiliation. Sophia felt her jaw tighten. I'll take that under advisement, sir. That evening, she sat alone in the barracks medical station, cleaning the abrasions where her prosthetic had rubbed her residual limb raw. The specialized liner had torn during the mud crawl, leaving her without proper protection for tomorrow's training. Without it, she'd face crippling pain that would certainly end her candidacy. Damage report, Hopper? Westfield asked, appearing in the doorway with two other top performers. His voice carried the false concern that barely masked mockery. Looks like your hardware's not military grade after all. Sophia continued cleaning the wounds without acknowledging him. You know, he continued, leaning against the doorframe, there's honor in knowing when to step aside. My father says leadership sometimes means recognizing when you're creating a liability for your team. She finally looked up, meeting his gaze directly. Thanks for the leadership lesson, Westfield. I'll file it with all the other, unsolicited opinions I've received since Kandahar. Something in her tone silenced even Westfield momentarily. The mention of Kandahar, one of the war's most notorious combat zones, hung in the air between them. Just trying to help, he said finally, his swagger returning. Don't want to see anyone get hurt trying to prove something that's already been disproven by physics. After they left, Sophia examined her damaged prosthetic liner. The specialized component would take at least a week to replace through normal channels, time she didn't have in this elimination-based program. Tomorrow would bring another physical challenge that would be nearly impossible without proper equipment. She made a decision that many would consider foolish, but that epitomized everything that had gotten her this far. Using her combat medical kit, duct tape, and materials borrowed from the maintenance shed, she constructed a makeshift liner that might hold for one more day. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't optimal, but it represented the adaptive thinking that had defined her recovery. As she worked late into the night, Sophia didn't know that her jury-rigged solution would become symbolic of everything the advanced combat leadership program claimed to value but had forgotten how to recognize. The next morning brought the tactical problem-solving assessment, a challenge that combined physical endurance with strategic thinking. Candidates would navigate a complex environment while responding to changing tactical scenarios and physical challenges. Major Rivera outlined the parameters with clinical precision. Combat leadership isn't just about physical capability. It's about maintaining cognitive function under extreme physical stress. Today's assessment will push those boundaries. Sophia's makeshift prosthetic liner already felt inadequate as she lined up at the starting position. The duct tape solution created uneven pressure points that would become increasingly painful throughout the course. She had calculated that she could endure approximately 45 minutes before the pain became potentially debilitating. The assessment began with a 2-mile tactical movement through rough terrain, weighted packs adding 40 pounds to each candidate's burden. Sophia modified her gait to distribute weight differently, knowing that her standard running technique would destroy her improvised liner too quickly. Westfield and the top performers pulled ahead immediately, covering ground with the confident efficiency of natural athletes. Sophia maintained a steady middle position, conserving energy and managing pain that grew with each step. By the first checkpoint, she could feel blood seeping into the makeshift liner as the temporary materials failed to provide adequate protection. The second phase introduced the cognitive challenges, tactical problems that required clear thinking. Despite mounting physical discomfort, candidates had to analyze combat scenarios, make resource allocation decisions, and demonstrate leadership thinking while continuing to navigate physically demanding obstacles. Sophia had always excelled at the cognitive aspects of military training. Her experience with pain management had inadvertently trained her to compartmentalize discomfort and maintain mental clarity, where other candidates began making errors. As physical fatigue accumulated, she maintained consistent performance on the tactical problems. The final challenge combined everything: a simulated casualty evacuation requiring teams of 4 to transport a 200-pound dummy through an obstacle course while responding to simulated enemy contact. Teams were assigned based on performance rankings, placing Sophia with 3 middling performers who made no effort to hide their disappointment at being grouped with Hopper. "Great, we get the gimp," muttered one candidate, not bothering to lower his voice. "There goes our ranking." Sophia ignored the comment, focusing instead on the tactical problem. The most efficient approach is to establish a rotation system rather than fixed carrying positions, she suggested as they gathered around the simulated casualty. "We'll preserve energy and maintain better situational awareness." The others exchanged glances but didn't openly challenge her. As they began the evacuation, the superior logic of her approach became evident. Rather than each person maintaining a fixed corner of the stretcher, they rotated positions every 100 meters, ensuring no one muscle group was overtaxed and that each team member had periodic opportunities to serve as security rather than bearer. Halfway through the course, Sophia's prosthetic began to fail catastrophically. The makeshift liner had disintegrated under the combined pressure of weight and movement, leaving her residual limb to rub directly against the hard socket. Each step sent lightning bolts of pain through her body, but she maintained her position and rotation without comment. One of her teammates noticed the blood now visibly seeping through her pant leg. "Ramirez, you're bleeding," he said during a rotation change. "Noted," she replied without breaking stride. "Doesn't affect the mission. Maintain rotation protocol." Something shifted in the team's dynamic. The candidate who had called her a gimp now watched her with an expression closer to confusion than contempt. Her refusal to acknowledge what must have been excruciating pain challenged his understanding of limitation. As they approached the final obstacle, a 40-foot wall that required the casualty to be hoisted using rope systems, Sophia's prosthetic socket had filled with enough blood to make squishing sounds with each step. Still, she continued calculating angles and directing the team's approach to the technical evacuation problem. "Standard hoisting approach won't work efficiently," she noted, dropping her pack to retrieve rope equipment. "We need a modified Z-pulley system with a floating redirect to compensate for the wall angle." "That's not the technique they taught." "US," argued one teammate. "It's a combat modification," Sophia explained, already setting up the system. "Developed it in Kandahar when we had to evacuate casualties from collapsed structures. Less energy expenditure, more mechanical advantage." Her hands worked with practiced precision despite the sweat pouring down her face from pain. The system she created looked unorthodox but functioned with remarkable efficiency, allowing their team to hoist the casualty with significantly less physical strain. They completed the evacuation course 17 minutes faster than any other team, a margin so significant that even Major Rivera seemed momentarily speechless. The team that had begun with visible disappointment at receiving Hopper finished with an undeniable competitive advantage because of her. As the assessment concluded, Sophia finally allowed herself to acknowledge the damage to her residual limb. The makeshift liner had failed completely, leaving bloody imprints on the inside of the prosthetic socket. She would need medical attention, and likely several days of recovery before the limb would be functional again. Major Rivera approached as the medic examined her leg. For the first time, his expression showed something other than skepticism. "That was unorthodox problem-solving, Ramirez," he said. watching as the medic cleaned blood from the carbon fiber socket. "Thank you, sir. You understand you'll need medical recovery time. The program doesn't stop for individual candidates." Sophia met his gaze directly. "I'm aware, sir. I'll be ready for tomorrow's evolution." Rivera's expression suggested he knew this was physically impossible, but he merely nodded and moved on. The message was clear. No accommodations would be made, regardless of the circumstances. In the medical facility that evening, the doctor examined Sophia's residual limb with professional concern. "This is a significant setback, Lieutenant Ramirez," he said, applying antimicrobial treatments to the abraded skin. "The tissue needs at least 72 hours without prosthetic wear to begin proper healing. Continued pressure could lead to infection and long-term damage." Sophia nodded, already calculating alternatives. "What about a rigid dressing with a temporary pylon? Something that distributes weight differently?" The doctor shook his head. "That's not advisable. The recommended course of action is rest and elevation." After he left, Sophia sat alone in the examination room, facing what seemed like an impossible choice. Following medical advice meant automatic dismissal from the program. Ignoring it meant risking permanent damage to her residual limb. She was still considering her options when an unexpected visitor arrived. Colonel Marcus Chun, the program director, rarely interacted with candidates directly. His appearance in the medical facility doorway was surprising enough that Sophia attempted to stand despite the doctor's orders. "At ease, Lieutenant," Chun said, waving her back to a seated position. "I've reviewed today's performance metrics." Sophia waited, uncertain where this conversation was heading. Chun was known for his by-the-book leadership and uncompromising standards. "Your tactical solution for the casualty evacuation was unorthodox," he continued, his expression unreadable. "Major Rivera had to consult with me about how to score it since it didn't follow prescribed methodologies." "I understand, sir. I apologize for the deviation from—" Chun held up his hand, stopping her. "I'm not here about that. I'm here about this." He gestured to her injured residual limb. "The doctor tells me you've been advised to avoid prosthetic use for 72 hours minimum." "Yes, sir. And yet I suspect you're planning to continue regardless." Sophia hesitated, weighing honesty against self-preservation. "I haven't made that determination yet, sir." Chun studied her for a long moment. "Lieutenant Ramirez, adaptability is a core leadership trait. So is knowing when adaptation crosses into recklessness." He placed a folder on the examination table. Beside her, "These are temporary medical exemption orders. You're assigned to tactical operations, planning for the next 3 days while that heals properly." Sophia stared at the folder in disbelief. "Sir, there are no exemptions in the Advanced Combat Leadership Program." "The standards are absolute. The standards are absolute," Chun agreed. "But they're also intelligent. We're not evaluating candidates on their ability to cause themselves permanent physical harm. We're evaluating leadership potential." He turned to leave but paused at the doorway. "Your solution today saved 16 minutes in a casualty evacuation scenario, Lieutenant. In combat, that's approximately 4 lives saved based on combat bleeding statistics. Remember that when Westfield and his friends call you Hopper." After Chun left, Sophia opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly. The exemption wasn't charity, it was a reassignment to a tactical planning team that would create scenarios for the next phase of candidate evaluation. She would be working directly with the program cadre, analyzing leadership approaches and helping design challenges. As she processed this unexpected development, James Westfield appeared in the doorway, his expression unusually somber. "Heard. You're out on medical," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Tough break." Sophia closed the folder. "Not out, reassigned." Westfield's eyebrows rose slightly. "Reassigned? That's not how this program works." "Apparently it is." She studied his face, trying to understand his presence. "Did you need something, Westfield?" He seemed uncharacteristically hesitant. "Your evac technique today, with the modified pulley system, that was impressive." The reluctant compliment hung in the air between them. Sophia nodded once, acknowledging it without comment. "Anyway," he continued, recovering his usual confidence, "don't get too comfortable. In your desk job, the real challenges are still ahead." As he walked away, Sophia realized something had shifted. The mockery remained, but beneath it lay something new, a grudging recognition that perhaps her differences weren't merely limitations. In a program designed to identify and develop combat leaders, she had demonstrated that adaptation could sometimes outperform standardization. She didn't know yet that this small realization would become crucial in the weeks ahead, or that the leadership watching her struggle had already noticed something that would change everything about how they evaluated combat potential. For now, she had 3 days to heal, to plan, and to prepare for whatever came next. The woman they'd tried to eliminate because of her prosthetic leg had instead been given an unexpected opportunity to demonstrate that leadership wasn't measured in physical perfection, but in the capacity to overcome imperfection with intelligence and determination. The challenge was far from over. In fact, it was about to become more complicated than anyone at Fort Brennan could possibly anticipate. Sophia's 3 days with the Tactical Operations Planning Team revealed a side of military leadership training she'd never fully appreciated. While her fellow candidates battled through grueling physical challenges, she sat in air-conditioned briefing rooms analyzing leadership decisions and scenario outcomes. At first, it felt like a consolation prize busywork designed to keep her occupied while preserving the program's reputation for not simply discarding wounded warriors. But by the second day, she realized she'd been given something far more valuable: insight into how the program's leaders actually evaluated candidates. "The physical challenges are mostly misdirection," explained Master Sergeant Diaz, a veteran instructor who'd been designing leadership scenarios for 15 years. "We push their bodies to exhaustion to see what their minds do under pressure. The candidates who think it's about being the strongest or fastest are usually the first real-world failures." Sophia absorbed this revelation while helping design the next phase of evaluation scenarios. Her residual limb throbbed beneath careful bandaging, healing gradually as she immersed herself in the psychological aspects of combat leadership assessment. "So why make it appear to be about physical dominance?" she asked Diaz as they reviewed candidate performance data. The weathered instructor smiled, crow's feet deepening around eyes that had seen too much combat. "Because the ones who believe the facade reveal who they truly are. The physical challenges are a lie detector, not the actual test." During scenario planning session, Sophia found herself offering perspectives that clearly surprised the senior instructors. Where standard scenarios focused on testing decisiveness under physical duress, she suggested modifications that evaluated adaptability when primary options failed. In real combat, the perfect physical specimen can still be rendered combat ineffective by circumstances beyond their control, she explained during one planning session. "What happens when the star quarterback breaks an ankle in the first quarter? We should test their contingency thinking." Colonel Chun, observing silently from the back of the room, nodded almost imperceptibly. The next day, the scenarios incorporated her suggestions. Candidates would face not just physical challenges, but unexpected equipment failures and simulated injuries that would force adaptation rather than pure physical performance. On the third day, as medical staff cleared her for return to full training activities, Major Rivera approached her workstation with an unusual request. "The Colonel wants your input on candidate evaluation metrics," he said, his tone suggesting he found the request as surprising as she did, particularly regarding adaptive leadership scoring. Sophia looked up from her laptop, momentarily speechless. Evaluation metrics were considered almost sacred in the program, the secret formula. vet determined who advanced to combat leadership roles. Sir, I'm still a candidate myself. Isn't that a conflict of interest? Rivera's expression remained neutral. You're being asked to provide insight based on your combat experience and your unique perspective, not to evaluate specific candidates. She understood the unspoken message. Her prosthetic leg, the very thing that had marked her as an outsider, was now being recognized as a potential source of valuable perspective on adaptation under adverse conditions. That afternoon, Sophia sat in Colonel Chun's office surrounded by decades of military tradition. Awards and campaign photographs lined the walls, silent testimony to a career dedicated to developing combat leaders. Lieutenant Ramirez, Chun began without preamble. Your experience in Kandahar. Tell me about the day you lost your leg. The question was abrupt, almost jarring in its directness. Sophia maintained her composure through practiced discipline. Third tour, sir. Our convoy hit a complex ambush IEDs followed by small arms fire from multiple positions. I was the platoon leader. She paused, the memories flooding back with unexpected clarity. When the first vehicle was disabled, I ordered a tactical dismount to establish security and assess casualties. Chun listened silently as she continued. The second IED detonated during casualty evacuation. I was approximately 7 meters from the point of detonation. The blast severed my left leg below the knee and caused significant damage to my right leg as well. Her voice remained clinical, detached, the voice of an officer delivering a report rather than a woman describing the moment her life changed. Forever. And after the blast? Chun prompted. I applied my own tourniquet and continued directing the defense until QRF arrived, approximately 22 minutes later. Chun leaned forward slightly. You continued to lead after losing a limb? Yes, sir. That was my responsibility. And did you follow standard tactical protocols during those 22 minutes? The question made her pause. Not entirely, sir. The situation required significant adaptation. We had lost communication capabilities and were taking fire from positions that weren't visible from our location due to terrain features. So you improvised? Yes, sir. I had 2 wounded machine gunners drag me to a position where I could observe the enemy approach angles. From there, I directed fire and movement using hand signals and runners until we established a defensible perimeter. Chun nodded slowly. Lieutenant, the Advanced Combat Leadership Program was established with one primary objective: identifying officers who can continue to function effectively when everything goes wrong. He gestured to a photograph on the wall, a younger version of himself in dust-covered combat gear, surrounded by equally exhausted soldiers. My experience in Iraq taught me that physical prowess means nothing if the mind breaks under pressure. Sophia waited, sensing there was more to this conversation than a trip down memory lane. The candidates who excel in our physical challenges, Chun continued, often become convinced of their own invincibility. They've never faced true limitation, so they don't know how to function when it inevitably finds them. He looked directly at her prosthetic leg. You begin with limitation as your baseline, which means every success requires adaptation. That's actually closer to combat reality than what candidates like Westfield experience. The insight struck Sophia with unexpected force. Her prosthetic hadn't just been a disadvantage. It had been preparing her for leadership in ways 2-legged candidates couldn't comprehend. I'd like you to assist in redesigning certain aspects of our evaluation framework, Chun said, sliding a folder across the desk. Specifically, how we measure adaptive performance under combat conditions. As Sophia returned to the barracks that evening, she found herself viewing the program through entirely new eyes. What had seemed like an impossible challenge designed to eliminate her now appeared as a complex evaluation system that might actually recognize the unique strengths her journey had forged. James Westfield was holding court in the common area as she entered, regaling his followers with stories from the day's training. Rivera actually said my tactical response was textbook perfect. He boasted, not bothering to lower his voice as Sophia passed. Said he hasn't seen execution that clean since he went through himself. She continued to her bunk without acknowledgement, but Westfield wasn't finished. "Hey Hopper, how was desk duty?" Getting comfortable pushing papers while the rest of us qualify for actual leadership? Sophia organized her gear methodically, checking her newly repaired prosthetic liner before responding. "The Colonel has interesting perspectives on what constitutes leadership qualification, Westfield. You might be surprised." Something in her tone gave him pause. The usual mockery faltered as uncertainty flickered across his features. "Whatever special treatment you're getting won't change the final scores," he said finally, but the declaration lacked his usual conviction. That night, as candidates prepared for the next day's challenges, a storm system moved across the Georgia countryside. Lightning illuminated the barracks in sporadic flashes as thunder rumbled through the bones of the old buildings. By morning, Fort Brennan's training grounds had transformed into a muddy obstacle course, more challenging than any designed by the instructors. Major Rivera surveyed the waterlogged terrain with grim satisfaction. "Weather is not a factor in combat readiness," he announced to the assembled candidates. "Today's land navigation exercise will proceed as planned. If anything, these conditions provide a more realistic assessment environment." Sophia checked her prosthetic connections, applying extra waterproofing to the electronic components. The medical staff had repaired her liner and reinforced the socket with improved padding. But muddy conditions presented unique challenges for prosthetic users. Where biological legs could adjust unconsciously to changing surface conditions, her carbon fiber limb required conscious adaptation with each step. Candidates will navigate to 7 checkpoints across a 15-kilometer course, Rivera continued. You'll receive mission-critical information at each checkpoint that will be required for your final navigation leg. Missing checkpoints means missing intelligence, which could prove fatal to your completion chances. The exercise began with candidates being transported to different drop points around the training area perimeter. Sophia found herself deployed to the northeastern corner of the reservation, the farthest insertion point from the final rally location. The message was clear: she would need to cover more ground than anyone else to complete the course. Rain continued to fall as she oriented her map and compass, plotting the most efficient route between checkpoints. The standard approach would follow terrain features like ridgelines and streams, but with the heavy rainfall, those same features would likely become hazardous. Lowland areas would be flooded and hillsides would become treacherous mudslides. Sophia made a decision that contradicted conventional wisdom. Rather than following the path of least resistance, she plotted a route that utilized higher ground, even though it meant more elevation change and greater physical exertion. In these conditions, the dry ground would be worth the extra effort. Her first checkpoint was 3 kilometers east, hidden in a stand of pine trees atop a modest ridge. She moved carefully, establishing a sustainable pace that accommodated her prosthetics limitations in the mud. Where other candidates might jog between points, she maintained a deliberate walk, using trekking poles to provide additional stability and distribute her weight more evenly. 2 hours into the exercise, the storm intensified. Lightning struck, close enough to raise the hair on her arms, followed immediately by deafening thunder. The rain became a solid wall of water, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters. Sophia took shelter beneath a rock outcropping, using the opportunity to clean mud from her prosthetic connections. As she worked, she heard voices approaching other candidates seeking the same shelter from the deluge. "This is insane," complained a voice she recognized as candidate Peterson. "We're going to get someone killed out here." "Rivera's pushing too hard," agreed another voice. Flash flood warnings were issued for the county this morning. They should have modified the exercise. Sophia remained silent, continuing her maintenance as 3 candidates crowded under the outcropping. They noticed her presence with visible surprise. Ramirez? Peterson squinted through the rain. How the hell are you this far along the course already? She secured her prosthetic and checked her map before responding. Alternative routing. The standard paths will be underwater by now. The candidates exchanged glances. They had clearly been following conventional navigation approaches. What's your next checkpoint? Asked candidate Taylor, the group's recognized navigation expert. Checkpoint 4, the abandoned fire tower, Sophia replied, seeing no competitive advantage in withholding the information during potentially dangerous conditions. Taylor shook her head. We just came from 3, and the valley between here and the tower is completely flooded. Must be at least waist deep in the low areas. Sophia considered this new information, recalculating her route. The ridge continues northeast for another kilometer before dropping off. Might be able to bypass the valley entirely. That's at least 2 extra kilometers of hiking, Peterson objected. Better than swimming, Sophia replied, gathering her equipment. You're welcome to join me if you want. The unexpected offer hung in the rain-soaked air. These candidates weren't Westfield's crowd, but they had never shown particular friendship toward Hopper either. After a moment's hesitation, Taylor nodded. Lead on, Ramirez. I'm not dying in a flash flood for a training exercise. What began as a practical alliance soon revealed the unique advantages of Sophia's approach to the challenge. Where most candidates tried to power through obstacles with physical strength, she had learned to navigate around them. Her route required more distance but avoided the worst conditions, resulting in steadier progress with less energy expenditure. By checkpoint 5, they had caught up with several frontrunners who had followed more direct routes, only to become bogged down in deteriorating conditions. Among them was James Westfield, covered in mud and visibly exhausted from fighting the elements head-on. His eyes widened at the sight of Sophia leading a group of increasingly respectful candidates. How the hell did you get here so fast? He demanded. Adaptation, she replied simply, checking in with the instructor manning the checkpoint. Sometimes the longest way around is the shortest way through. The final 2 checkpoints presented the greatest challenges. A bridge crossing had been washed out completely, forcing candidates to improvise a crossing over the swollen creek. While others attempted complicated rope systems with varying degrees of success, Sophia located a fallen tree upstream that provided a natural, if precarious, crossing point. By the time they reached the final rally point, Sophia's group had grown to include 7 candidates who recognized the advantages of her unconventional approach. They arrived together among the first 15 finishers despite having covered significantly more ground than those who had started closer to the endpoint. Major Rivera checked them in with a raised eyebrow, but offered no comment on their collaborative approach. The exercise had been designed as an individual assessment, but real combat never perfectly matched training parameters. As candidates recovered in the rally tent, comparing notes and experiences, something unexpected happened. Taylor approached Sophia with a canteen of hot coffee. That was impressive navigation, Ramirez, she said, offering the steaming drink. You saved us hours of misery out there. Just experience, Sophia replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. When you can't move quickly, you learn to move smart. Smart beats fast when fast gets stuck in the mud. Taylor agreed with a tired smile. Some of us are grabbing dinner together once we're back at base. You should join. The casual invitation represented a significant shift. For the first time since arriving at Fort Brennan, Sophia was being recognized for her capabilities rather than defined by her limitation. Later that evening, as a smaller storm front moved through, the base emergency sirens activated. Candidates rushed from the mess hall to their designated rally points, as Rivera's voice came over the announcement system. This is not a drill. Flash flood warnings have escalated to emergency status. All personnel report to Building 17 for emergency response assignments. The scene in Building 17, the base's largest administrative facility, was controlled chaos. Base personnel coordinated with local emergency management as the storm threatened to overwhelm nearby communities. The situation had deteriorated faster than weather services had predicted, with multiple counties now facing imminent flooding. Colonel Chun addressed the assembled candidates with characteristic directness. This is now a real-world emergency response operation. The governor has activated National Guard units, but we are the closest military assets available. You will be assigned to teams based on your demonstrated capabilities. Sophia expected to be assigned to a support role given her prosthetic, but Chun had other ideas. Lieutenant Ramirez will coordinate the technical rescue planning cell, he announced, surprising everyone including Sophia herself. Her navigation team demonstrated superior terrain analysis during today's exercise. That's exactly what we need for rescue route planning. James Westfield, who had finished the navigation course nearly an hour after Sophia, despite his significant head start, found himself assigned to her planning team. His expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Sir," he objected, approaching Major Rivera after the assignments were announced. "I'm qualified for direct action teams. My physical scores are irrelevant if you can't reach the objective, Lieutenant Westfield," Rivera interrupted. "You spent 3 hours trying to force your way through a flooded valley today because you were too stubborn to adapt your route. That kind of thinking gets people killed in these conditions." Westfield's jaw tightened, but he offered no further objection as he joined Sophia's team in the planning room. The dynamic was unavoidably awkward. The program's physical standout now reporting to the woman he'd mockingly called Hopper for weeks. "We need to identify viable extraction routes for 3 communities along the Coosa River watershed," Sophia began, spreading maps across the planning table. "Standard roads will be underwater within the next 2 hours, based on current projections." Her team included 5 other candidates with various specialties. All except Westfield engaged immediately, offering observations and suggestions as they analyzed topographic data. He remained silent, standing slightly apart with arms crossed. "Westfield," Sophia said directly, "you've got the best heavy vehicle qualification scores in the program. I need your input on which emergency vehicles can manage these alternate routes." The direct appeal to his expertise and the fact that she knew about his specialized qualification seemed to catch him off guard. After a moment's hesitation, he approached the map and began assessing the terrain from a new perspective. "These access roads are rated for civilian traffic," he noted, indicating several potential routes. "But heavy rescue vehicles would destroy the surface in these conditions. We'd need to identify harder terrain-packed gravel or areas with underlying bedrock." For the next several hours, the planning team worked seamlessly to develop evacuation and rescue routes for communities in the flood's path. Sophia's experience navigating difficult terrain with her prosthetic translated into insights about ground conditions that more conventionally mobile planners might overlook. "The county emergency manager says your routing information just saved them at least 2 hours of trial and error," Colonel Chun announced, entering the planning room with a satellite phone. "National Guard assets are moving along your designated corridors now." As the emergency response continued through the night, Fort Brennan transformed from a training facility into a genuine command center. Candidates who had been competing against each other days earlier now worked together, applying their developing leadership skills to a real crisis. By dawn, the worst of the flooding had begun to recede, but the emergency operations continued. Sophia had been awake for nearly 30 hours, coordinating route planning and maintenance as conditions evolved. Her prosthetic leg ached from the prolonged activity, but she remained focused on the mission. "You should get some rest," Westfield said, approaching her workstation with a cup of coffee. The gesture was unexpected, almost friendly, coming from someone who had been her most vocal critic. "Too much happening," she replied, accepting the coffee nonetheless. "The governor's visiting the forward command post this afternoon. We need to make sure the routes stay viable." Westfield studied her with newfound consideration. "You know, I had you all wrong, Ramirez." She looked up from her maps, surprised by the admission. "I figured the prosthetic was just a reason to give you special treatment," he continued. "Thought you were getting some kind of public relations pass through the program. And now?" She prompted when he didn't continue. "Now I'm wondering if I've been focusing on the wrong things altogether." He gestured to the emergency operations center around them. "All my physical qualification scores didn't prepare me for this. But you've been dealing with adaptation as your baseline for years." The acknowledgement wasn't quite an apology, but it represented a fundamental shift in perspective that Sophia recognized as significant. Before she could respond, Colonel Chun entered the planning room with news that would change everything. "I've just received word that General Michael Hayes will be accompanying the governor this afternoon," he announced. "They're doing a press event at the forward command post to highlight the military's emergency response coordination." The name sent a ripple of recognition through the room. General Hayes wasn't just any general, he was a living legend, one of only 12 living Medal of Honor recipients from the Afghanistan conflict. His heroic actions during a complex ambush had saved his entire company and become required study. At West Point, "The visit location has changed," Chun continued. "They'll be using the Highway 27 crossing point rather than the command center. Apparently, the visual of rescue operations makes for better media coverage." Sophia exchanged glances with her planning team. Highway 27 had been one of the most problematic crossing points in their analysis, with underwater hazards that weren't visible from the surface. They had specifically recommended against using it for anything but emergency crossings. "Sir," she said, standing despite her exhaustion, "our terrain analysis indicated significant undercutting along the Highway 27 embankment. The road surface appears intact, but ground-penetrating radar showed substantial erosion beneath the apparent edge." Chun frowned. "When was this assessment conducted?" 6 hours ago, sir. We've been focusing resources on more stable crossing points since then." The colonel pulled Sophia aside, lowering his voice. "The visit is happening regardless, Lieutenant. Political considerations have overruled technical ones. I need your team to determine how to make that location as safe as possible within the next 4 hours." As Chun walked away, Sophia turned to find her entire team watching expectantly, waiting for direction. Even Westfield seemed to be looking to her for leadership, a remarkable reversal from their first weeks of training. "We've got a new mission," she announced, returning to the planning table. "And it's going to require every adaptation technique we've developed." The team worked frantically to develop safety protocols for the high-profile visit. They coordinated with engineering units to conduct updated assessments, established visual marking systems for safe zones, and developed contingency plans for various scenarios. 4 hours later, Sophia stood at the Highway 27 crossing point as a convoy of black SUVs approached. The water level had receded significantly, but she knew the invisible damage beneath the road surface remained a critical concern. Her team had placed safety markers and positioned rescue assets nearby, the best they could do given the constraints. As the vehicles stopped and security personnel established a perimeter, Sophia briefed the site security officer on their safety concerns. "The road appears stable but isn't. We've marked the safe observation area with orange indicators. Please ensure all VIPs remain within that zone." The officer nodded, but Sophia could see the political momentum already building. Aides and media were positioning for the perfect camera angles, ignoring the safety markers in pursuit of better visuals. The governor emerged from the lead vehicle, followed by General Hayes, a tall, imposing figure whose presence commanded immediate respect. Sophia watched with growing concern as the media event began to drift toward the unstable portion of the roadway. The governor, eager to demonstrate his hands-on leadership, moved closer to the water's edge where rescue boats were operating. General Hayes and his security detail followed, now well outside the designated safe zone. She approached Major Rivera, who was coordinating the military aspect of the visit. "Sir, they're moving into the danger area. The subsurface erosion is severe in that section." Rivera assessed the situation with a frown. "I'll speak to the governor's chief of staff, but this is already in motion. Stay alert." Sophia's years of combat experience had taught her to recognize the moments before disaster. Something in the way the water moved against the road edge triggered her warning instincts. A subtle change in current pattern, visible only to someone specifically watching for it, indicated something shifting beneath the surface. Without hesitation, she moved toward the danger, her prosthetic leg splashing through puddles as she broke into a run. "General Hayes," she called out, protocol forgotten in the urgency of the moment. "Sir, you need to move back immediately." The general turned toward her voice just as a sickening crack echoed across the water. The road edge where he stood began to crumble, concrete breaking away as the undermined section collapsed. Hayes stumbled, losing his balance as the ground literally disappeared beneath him. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as impossible. Sophia launched herself forward, her prosthetic leg giving her a final push as she dove toward the falling general. Her fingers caught his uniform as gravity pulled him toward the churning floodwater below. Her other hand somehow found purchase on a twisted section of rebar, now exposed in the broken concrete. For a suspended moment, she hung between solid ground and empty air, one arm supporting the weight of a Medal of Honor recipient while the other strained to maintain their tenuous connection to safety. Her prosthetic leg, the very thing that had marked her as supposedly less capable, wedged against a concrete chunk, providing crucial leverage that a flesh-and-blood limb could never have sustained. "Hold on, sir," she grunted through clenched teeth, muscles burning with effort. "Help is coming." Within seconds, Westfield and two other candidates reached the edge, forming a human chain to pull them back from disaster. As they dragged both Sophia and the general to safety, the entire road section collapsed into the floodwater with a thunderous roar. General Hayes, covered in mud but otherwise unharmed, looked at Sophia with an expression of profound shock. His eyes moved from her face to her prosthetic leg, now visible where her uniform pants had torn during the rescue. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, "I believe you just saved my life." Before she could respond, medical personnel swarmed them both, checking for injuries. The governor's security detail had pulled him to safety seconds before the collapse, and he now stood nearby, visibly shaken by the near tragedy. As the chaos subsided and the VIPs were moved to a genuinely secure location, Sophia found herself sitting on the bumper of a medical vehicle, allowing a medic to examine her prosthetic for damage. The carbon fiber shell had cracked under the extreme pressure, and the hydraulic components were compromised, but it had held when it mattered most. "Lieutenant Ramirez," called a voice she recognized immediately. Colonel Chun approached with General Hayes beside him. Sophia attempted to stand and render proper honors, but Hayes waved her back down. "At ease, Lieutenant. I think you've earned a moment's rest." "Sir, I was just doing my job." Hayes exchanged a meaningful glance with Chun before responding. "Your job was route planning, Lieutenant, not diving off collapsing infrastructure to catch falling generals. Adaptation to changing conditions." "Sir," she replied with the ghost of a smile. "The cornerstone of effective leadership." The general's weathered face broke into an appreciative grin. "Colonel Chun has been telling me about your performance in the Advanced Combat Leadership Program. He seems to think you're redefining some of their fundamental assumptions about what makes an effective combat leader. That's giving me too Much credit, sir. I don't think so, Hayes said thoughtfully. Leadership isn't about being the strongest or fastest. It's about making the right decisions under impossible circumstances. He glanced at her damaged prosthetic. And sometimes, Lieutenant, our greatest strengths grow from our most difficult challenges. The conversation was interrupted as medical personnel insisted on moving both Sophia and the general to the field hospital for proper examination. As they walked toward the waiting vehicles, Hayes asked a question that caught her completely off. "Guard, tell me, Lieutenant Ramirez, where do you see yourself after completing this program?" The question seemed so disconnected from their current circumstances that Sophia hesitated before answering. "Honestly, sir, I've been focused on proving I could complete the program at all. I haven't thought much beyond that." Hayes nodded, as if her answer confirmed something important. Sometimes we become so focused on proving others wrong that we forget to consider what we actually want. He paused before adding, "I'll be interested to see where your path leads." As they parted ways, Sophia couldn't possibly know that this brief encounter would reshape her military career in ways she had never imagined. For now, she was simply a lieutenant with a broken prosthetic and the growing realization that the very thing that had marked her as different had become her greatest asset. The road back to Fort Brennan was quiet, the emergency vehicles moving carefully through the flood-damaged landscape. Sophia stared out the window, watching the devastation gradually give way to more familiar terrain. Something fundamental had shifted during this crisis, not just in how others saw her, but in how she understood herself. The woman they had mockingly called Hopper had just saved a Medal of Honor recipient from disaster. But more importantly, she had begun to recognize that her journey wasn't about proving she could be like everyone else despite her prosthetic leg. It was about demonstrating how her unique perspective made her exactly the kind of leader the military most desperately needed. The days following the flood emergency transformed life at Fort Brennan in ways no one could have anticipated. What had begun as a standard training cycle for the Advanced Combat Leadership program had evolved into a real-world case study in crisis response. Candidates who had been focused on individual advancement suddenly found themselves processing actual combat-adjacent experiences and reevaluating their understanding of leadership. For Sophia Ramirez, the changes were even more profound. The lieutenant who had arrived as an outsider, defined primarily by her prosthetic leg, had emerged as something entirely different, a symbol of adaptive leadership that contradicted conventional military wisdom. The prosthetics team at Walter Reed says they'll have a replacement delivered by tomorrow morning, Colonel Chen informed her during a medical follow-up. Apparently, General Hayes made some calls. They're sending their newest combat-optimized model. Sophia sat on the examination table, her damaged prosthetic removed to reveal the scarred residual limb beneath. Without the carbon fiber extension, she felt physically diminished but strangely more complete as a leader than she had ever been before. "That's very generous of the general," she replied, uncomfortable with the special attention. "But I don't want to jump the queue ahead of deploying soldiers who need prosthetics." Chun shook his head. "You're not understanding, Lieutenant. They're not bumping you ahead in a queue." Hayes called the director of the Advanced Prosthetics program directly. "They're sending you a prototype that isn't even in general distribution yet. Apparently, your performance during the flood emergency made quite an impression." Before Sophia could respond, the base psychiatrist entered the examination room with a tablet in hand. Dr. Winters specialized in combat stress reactions and leadership psychology for the program. "Lieutenant Ramirez," she said with a professional smile, "I'd like to conduct a brief assessment of your psychological state following yesterday's incident. It's standard procedure after high-stress emergency operations." Chun excused himself, leaving Sophia alone with the psychiatrist. She had expected this evaluation. The military took psychological monitoring seriously, especially after high adrenaline incidents, but something in the doctor's demeanor suggested this was more than A routine checkup. Let's start with the basics, Winters began, activating her tablet. How would you describe your decision-making process when you observed the road beginning to collapse? Sophia considered the question carefully. There wasn't really a process. Doctor, I recognized the danger and responded based on training and instinct. Interesting choice of words, Winters noted. Most candidates describe their emergency actions in terms of tactical assessment and deliberate choice. You're framing it as instinctual. Because it was, Sophia replied simply. There wasn't time for a tactical decision tree. The psychiatrist made notes before continuing. You put yourself at extreme physical risk to save General Hayes. Were you aware of the potential consequences to yourself when you acted? The question carried implications that Sophia immediately recognized. They were assessing whether her actions represented healthy courage or unhealthy recklessness, a critical distinction for military leadership qualification. I was aware of the risk, she answered carefully. But I also had confidence in my physical capabilities, including the structural advantages of my prosthetic in that specific situation. A flesh leg would have snapped under the torque I applied, but carbon fiber has different stress tolerances. Winters looked up from her tablet, genuine surprise crossing her features. You factually assessed the structural advantages of your prosthetic during a split-second life-or-death situation? Not consciously in the moment, Sophia clarified. But I've spent 3 years learning exactly what this technology can and cannot do. That knowledge becomes integrated into your situational awareness. The evaluation continued for nearly an hour, ranging from standard trauma assessment questions to increasingly specific inquiries about Sophia's psychological adaptation to her prosthetic. Throughout the conversation, she sensed the doctor was searching for something beyond the standard measures of combat readiness. One final question, Lieutenant, Winters said as the session concluded. How do you feel about the way your prosthetic has influenced your leadership development? Sophia had been expecting clinical inquiries about flashbacks or anxiety levels, not philosophical reflection. The question required consideration. Initially, I saw it as an obstacle to overcome, she answered honestly. Something that made me different in a profession that values conformity. Now I'm beginning to recognize it as a unique perspective. I approach problems differently because I've had to adapt to a changed physical reality. That adaptation extends beyond the physical into tactical and strategic thinking. The psychiatrist nodded slowly, making final notes before setting her tablet aside. Lieutenant, I'm going to share something that doesn't normally leave assessment discussions. Your psychological profile is showing an unusual pattern that we've observed in only a small percentage of combat leaders, mostly those who have overcome significant personal trauma or disability. What pattern is that? Accelerated integration of adversity, Winters explained. Most people who experience traumatic injuries or significant setbacks go through predictable psychological phases: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and eventually acceptance. This typically takes years, with each phase influencing decision-making in specific ways. You appear to have not only completed this cycle, but transformed the experience into a leadership advantage. Sophia wasn't certain how to respond. The clinical analysis of her personal journey felt simultaneously validating and uncomfortably exposing. I'm still working through it daily, she admitted. It's not as complete as your assessment suggests. That's precisely the insight that confirms the assessment, Winters replied with a knowing smile. The most effective leaders recognize that adaptation is never finished. It's a continuous process. As Sophia left the medical facility, temporarily using crutches while awaiting her replacement prosthetic, she found James Westfield waiting outside. His presence was unexpected, and his typically confident demeanor seemed subdued. Ramirez, he acknowledged with a nod. Got a minute? They moved to a nearby seating area overlooking the training grounds. Candidates were running drills in the distance, the program continuing despite the recent emergency interruption. Sophia arranged her crutches and took a seat, waiting for Westfield to speak. "I owe you an apology," he began, the words clearly difficult for him. "Not just for the nickname or the comments, though those were bad enough. I owe you an apology for something more fundamental." Sophia remained silent, allowing him the space to continue. "I made assumptions about capability based on what I could see," he continued. "Assumed that physical wholeness equated to leadership. Potential. It was arrogant and, worse, it was factually wrong." He gestured toward the training grounds. "Yesterday proved that." "Yesterday was an unusual situation," Sophia offered. "Uncomfortable with being positioned as some kind of inspirational figure." "That's exactly the point," Westfield countered. "Real leadership happens in unusual situations. Everything else is just rehearsal." He turned to face her directly. "My father was a general. I've been preparing for this program my entire life, special training, advanced courses, the best equipment. I thought leadership was something you could perfect through practice and physical excellence. And now?" Sophia prompted when he fell silent. "Now I'm realizing that maybe I've been training for a test that doesn't actually measure what matters." He shook his head, as if trying to reorganize long-held beliefs. "My father always said excellence is a habit, but he never specified. What kind of excellence actually saves lives when everything goes wrong?" The conversation marked a turning point, not just in their relationship but in the program's dynamics. Word of Sophia's actions during the flood emergency had spread throughout Fort Brennan, enhanced by first-hand accounts from those who had witnessed her save. General Hayes, the woman they had mockingly called Hopper, had become something else entirely, a case study in adaptive leadership that challenged traditional military paradigms. The next morning brought a unique delivery to Fort Brennan. A specialized medical transport arrived carrying not just a replacement prosthetic, but an entire technical team from Walter Reed's Advanced Prosthetics Program. Dr. Eleanor Park, the program's civilian director, personally supervised the delivery. "Lieutenant Ramirez," she greeted Sophia in the medical facility. "It's an honor to meet you. General Hayes speaks very highly of your capabilities." The prosthetic they unveiled was unlike anything Sophia had seen before in Next Generation. Combat model with adaptive microprocessors and enhanced structural components. The sleek carbon fiber shell housed military-grade hydraulics and neural interface systems that promised unprecedented responsiveness. "This is the NX-7 prototype," Dr. Park explained as technicians prepared for the fitting. "We've been developing it for Special Operations Command, but your situation presents a unique opportunity for field assessment under leadership conditions rather than just combat applications." The fitting process took nearly 3 hours with multiple calibrations and neural mapping sessions to optimize the interface between Sophia's nervous system and the prosthetics response protocols. As technicians made final adjustments, Dr. Park shared something unexpected. "You know, we've been studying the psychological dimensions of prosthetic adaptation for years," she said conversationally. "Most users see their prosthetics as tools or replacements for what they've lost. A small percentage, typically high performers, like yourself, eventually integrate the technology as an enhancement rather than a limitation." Sophia tested the new prosthetic's responsiveness, impressed by its intuitive movement. "I'm not sure I'd go that far. I'm still very aware of its limitations." "Of course," Park nodded. "But you've also begun identifying its unique advantages in specific situations, which is remarkably rare. Most users focus exclusively on approximating natural function rather than discovering new capabilities." The observation resonated with Sophia's evolving relationship with her prosthetic. What had begun as a reminder of loss had gradually transformed into something more complex, a different way of experiencing and navigating the world that occasionally offered unexpected advantages. With the new prosthetic successfully fitted, Sophia returned to the training program the following day. The remaining 3 weeks of the Advanced Combat Leadership Program had been modified to incorporate lessons from the flood emergency response, with increased emphasis on adaptive decision-making under unpredictable conditions. Colonel Chun greeted her return with an announcement that changed the program structure. Based on recent events, we're implementing a new evaluation framework that pairs candidates with complementary skill sets. Lieutenant Ramirez and Lieutenant Westfield will co-lead Alpha Team for the final leadership assessment. The pairing was symbolic, the program's physical standout, working alongside the woman he had once dismissed as incapable. The message to all candidates was unmistakable. True leadership transcended individual capability and recognized the value of diverse perspectives. Westfield approached their first planning session with unexpected humility. "I think we should leverage your adaptive routing expertise for the navigation components," he suggested as they analyzed the final assessment parameters. "My vehicle operation background complements your terrain analysis." The collaborative approach represented a dramatic evolution from the competitive environment that had defined the program's early weeks. Other candidate teams began adopting similar complementary strategies, recognizing that diverse capabilities created more robust leadership solutions than individual excellence alone. The final assessment scenario unfolded across 3 days of continuous operations. Teams navigated complex terrain, responded to simulated crises, and demonstrated their leadership capabilities under conditions designed to test both physical endurance and adaptive decision-making. Sophia and Westfield's team established an early advantage through their complementary approach. Where other teams attempted to power through obstacles directly, Alpha Team consistently found alternative solutions that conserved resources and maintained operational effectiveness over the extended timeline. The transformation wasn't just about Sophia Ramirez becoming accepted despite her prosthetic leg. It was about military leadership evolving to recognize that adaptation to limitation might actually be the most crucial capability in an increasingly complex combat environment. As candidates gathered for their final evening at Fort Brennan, the conversations reflected this evolving understanding. Leaders like James Westfield, who had begun the program believing in physical perfection as the foundation of combat leadership, now spoke of adaptive capacity and complementary capabilities. "The thing about Ramirez," Westfield was explaining to a group of fellow candidates, "is that she never tried to pretend the prosthetic wasn't a factor. She built her entire approach around knowing exactly what it could and couldn't do, then finding advantages where they existed and workarounds where they didn't." The insight represented a fundamental shift in how these future commanders would approach both personal limitation and unit capability. Rather than demanding uniform excellence across standardized metrics, they were beginning to recognize the strategic advantage of diverse approaches to common challenges. For Sophia, sitting slightly apart from the group as she reviewed her new assignment parameters, the evening brought a moment of quiet reflection. The journey from wounded warrior to leadership instructor had never been her intended path, but it had revealed capabilities she might never have discovered otherwise. "Lieutenant Ramirez," called a voice from the doorway. Dr. Winters, the program psychiatrist, gestured for her to step outside. "I have something for you before you leave tomorrow." Outside, beneath the Georgia stars, Winters handed her a small package. "This is somewhat unorthodox, but I thought you should have it." Inside was a leather-bound journal with an inscription. On the first page, "Adaptation is not accommodation to limitation, but discovery of new capability. Dr. E. Winters, Fort Brennan, ACLP." "I'd like you to document your journey," Winters explained. "Not just for the Pentagon Initiative, but for the wounded warriors coming behind you who need to understand that their injuries aren't the end of capability, but the beginning of adaptation." The request touched something deep in Sophia's understanding of her own journey. What had begun as a personal mission to prove herself had evolved into something with implications far beyond her individual career. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to guide others through that transition," she admitted. "I'm still figuring it out myself." Winters smiled knowingly. "That's precisely what qualifies you, Lieutenant. The leaders who believe they've completed their journey of adaptation are the ones least equipped to guide others through theirs." As Sophia returned to the barracks, journal in hand, she found herself contemplating the strange symmetry of her journey. The mockery she had endured during those first weeks at Fort Brennan, the dismissive nickname, the doubt, the assumption of limitation had actually revealed the very quality that now distinguished her as a leader. The woman they had called Hopper had demonstrated that adaptation to limitation wasn't merely about overcoming adversity. It was about discovering that what appeared to be weakness could actually become strength when approached with the right mindset. That night, she made her first entry in the journal, writing words that would eventually become the foundation of a leadership doctrine taught throughout the military. True capability isn't measured by performance under ideal conditions, but by adaptation when those conditions fail. What defines us is not what we can do when everything works as expected, but what we create when nothing does. The next morning, as she prepared to depart Fort Brennan for her new assignment, Sophia Ramirez stood at the same parade ground where she had once been mockingly called Hopper by peers who saw only limitation where capability existed. The prosthetic leg that had once marked her as different now represented something else entirely, a visible reminder that adaptation to limitation might actually be leadership's most crucial capability. As her transport arrived, she noticed James Westfield approaching with an outstretched hand. "Lieutenant Ramirez," he said with newfound respect, "I owe my development as a leader to your example. Thank you for showing me what I couldn't see before." She accepted his handshake with a genuine smile. "Leadership isn't about being perfect, Westfield. It's about being adaptable when perfection fails." "I won't forget," he promised. "And neither will anyone else who witnessed what happened here." As Sophia boarded the transport that would carry her toward her new role, helping reshape military leadership doctrine, she realized that her journey had come full circle. The woman they had mocked for her missing leg had ultimately stood tall enough for a Medal of Honor recipient to rise and salute her, not despite her prosthetic, but because of everything it had taught her about the true nature of leadership. The road ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities to demonstrate that adaptation wasn't merely about overcoming limitation. It was about discovering that sometimes what appears to be our greatest weakness contains the seed of our most distinctive strength. 2 years after the events at Fort Brennan, Lieutenant Colonel Sophia Ramirez stood at the podium of the National Defense University, addressing the incoming class of the Joint Advanced Warfighting School. The auditorium was filled with mid-career officers selected for their leadership potential, the future strategic thinkers and commanders of America's military forces. "Leadership," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "is not about performing perfectly under ideal conditions. It's about adapting effectively when conditions fail catastrophically." The promotion to lieutenant colonel had come unusually quickly, accelerated by her contributions to the Pentagon's adaptive leadership initiative and the dramatic success of the programs she had helped develop. What had begun as one general's recognition of unique potential had evolved into an institutional reassessment of how leadership capability was identified and developed throughout the military. "Each of you arrived here with impressive records," Sophia continued, scanning the audience of majors and lieutenant colonels. "Distinguished service, exemplary fitness reports, advanced tactical expertise. But those accomplishments primarily demonstrate your capacity to excel within established parameters." She stepped from behind the podium, allowing the assembled officers to see her full form, including the advanced prosthetic leg now visible beneath her uniform pants. "The challenges you'll face as strategic leaders won't come with established parameters or doctrinal solutions. They'll emerge from the gaps between what we've prepared for and what actually happens. Your effectiveness will be determined not by how perfectly you implement existing doctrine, but by how adaptively you create new approaches when that doctrine fails. The philosophy had become the cornerstone of military leadership development. In the years since Fort Brennan, what had begun as one officer's journey to prove herself despite physical limitation had catalyzed a fundamental reassessment of how combat leadership was identified, developed, and deployed. After the lecture, Brigadier General Michael Chun, formerly Colonel Chun of Fort Brennan, approached Sophia with a knowing smile. "Still converting the skeptics, I see," he said, shaking her hand warmly, "though there are fewer of them these days." "Old paradigms die hard, sir," she replied, "especially in institutions built on standardization." Chun nodded thoughtfully. "That's why your voice remains so essential. You're not just advocating for a theoretical approach, you're living proof of its validity." They walked together across the campus, discussing the evolution of the adaptive leadership initiative that had grown from their shared experience at Fort Brennan. What had begun as an experimental program had expanded into a core component of officer development throughout all service branches. "The Joint Chiefs are specifically requesting your participation in the strategic review next month," Chun mentioned as they reached the faculty building. "Your perspective on asymmetric adaptation has particular relevance to emerging battlefield conditions." The invitation represented the highest level of strategic planning, a remarkable evolution from the lieutenant who had once been mockingly called Hopper by her peers. But Sophia's journey had never been about personal advancement. It had been about transforming institutional understanding of leadership itself. "Before I forget," Chun added, "there's someone who'd like to meet with you while you're in Washington. Lieutenant General Hayes sends his regards." The name triggered immediate recognition. General Hayes, the Medal of Honor recipient, whose life she had saved during the flood emergency, had continued his own ascent through the military hierarchy, now serving as the Vice Chief of Staff for the Army. The general is hosting a special symposium on next-generation leadership at the Pentagon tomorrow. Chun explained. He specifically requested your participation on the senior panel alongside himself. The invitation carried profound symbolic significance. Being positioned as a peer alongside a Medal of Honor recipient at a strategic leadership symposium represented institutional validation of everything Sophia had demonstrated since her days at Fort Brennan. The next morning, Sophia arrived at the Pentagon with the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. The massive military headquarters bustled with activity as officers and civilian staff navigated its labyrinthine corridors. Despite having visited numerous times for initiative meetings, the building's scale and significance still impressed her. The auditorium where the symposium would take place was already filling with senior military leaders when she arrived. Generals and admirals representing all service branches mingled with defense policy experts and military educators. At the front of the room, Lieutenant General Hayes was engaged in conversation with several high-ranking officers. When he spotted Sophia entering, Hayes excused himself and approached with a warm smile. "Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez," he greeted her, extending his hand. "Thank you for joining us today. Your perspective will be invaluable to this discussion." As they exchanged greetings, Sophia noticed something unexpected, a slight limp in the general's gait that hadn't been present 2 years earlier. Hayes noted her observation with a wry smile. "Afghanistan, 3 months ago. I'd during a forward operating base visit. Nothing compared to what you experienced, but enough to give me a new appreciation for adaptive mobility." He gestured toward his right leg, where an inconspicuous bulge beneath his uniform pants suggested a prosthetic or supportive device of some kind. "The doctors wanted the medical retirement," he continued conversationally. "I referenced your case as precedent for continued service. Told them if a lieutenant with a full prosthetic could save my life and transform leadership doctrine, a general with a partial one could certainly continue to serve effectively. The revelation added unexpected dimension to their shared connection. What had begun as a rescue during an emergency had evolved into something more profound: mutual understanding of adaptation through personal limitation. As the symposium began, Sophia found herself seated on the main panel between Hayes and the Commandant of the Marine Corps. The positioning was deliberate, placing her perspective on adaptive leadership at the literal center of the military's most senior leadership. Hayes opened the session with remarks that highlighted how far institutional thinking had evolved since Fort Brennan. For generations, we've selected and developed leaders based primarily on standardized metrics of performance. Under controlled conditions, he explained to the assembled leaders, we've privileged those who excelled at predetermined challenges while often overlooking those who demonstrated exceptional adaptation to unexpected ones. He gestured toward Sophia. Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez represents a turning point in our understanding of combat leadership. Her journey from wounded warrior to doctrinal innovator demonstrates the qualities we most desperately need in next-generation leaders, not just excellence in executing established protocols, but mastery in creating new approaches when those protocols fail. The symposium discussions ranged from tactical adaptability to strategic resilience, with Sophia contributing insights drawn from both her personal experience and the institutional research she had helped pioneer. Throughout the conversations, she observed a fundamental shift in how senior military leaders conceptualized leadership capability. During a brief break between sessions, an unexpected visitor approached Lieutenant Colonel James Westfield, her former antagonist from Fort Brennan, now commanding a Special Forces battalion. Colonel Ramirez, he greeted her with genuine respect. I hoped I might find you here. The transformation in Westfield remained remarkable to Sophia. The arrogant recruit who had once dismissed her as incapable had evolved into a thoughtful commander who had incorporated adaptive leadership principles throughout his unit's operations. Your battalion's performance in the Kringle Valley operation was exceptional, she acknowledged, referencing a recent deployment where his forces had demonstrated remarkable adaptation to rapidly changing conditions. The after-action report is being used as a case study at the War College. Westfield shook his head with a self-deprecating smile. Everything valuable in that operation came from what I learned watching you at Fort Brennan. My father's generation believed leadership was about being the strongest person in the room. You showed me it's actually about creating strength from whatever resources and limitations exist in the moment. Their conversation was interrupted as Hayes called the symposium back to order. The afternoon session focused on institutionalizing adaptive leadership throughout military education and training systems, the practical application of philosophical shifts that had begun with Sophia's experience. As the day concluded, Hayes approached Sophia with an unexpected request. I'd like you to accompany me to Walter Reed tomorrow. There's someone there you should meet. The following morning, Sophia found herself walking through the rehabilitation center at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, accompanying one of the nation's most decorated soldiers on what appeared to be a personal mission rather than an official visit. The rehabilitation facility had been Sophia's home for months after losing her leg in Kandahar. The sights, sounds, and even smells triggered powerful memories, not all of them pleasant. This was where she had learned to walk again, where she had fought through pain and frustration to reclaim her identity as a soldier. Hayes led her to a physical therapy room where a young female lieutenant was working through grueling prosthetic training exercises. The determination on the officer's face was familiar to Sophia, the same focused intensity she had once brought to these same challenges. Lieutenant Carter, Hayes called softly. The young officer looked up, momentarily startled to find the 3-star general and lieutenant colonel observing her therapy session. She attempted to stand at attention, despite the obvious difficulty. At ease, Lieutenant, Hayes said quickly. Please, don't interrupt your session. I just wanted to introduce you to someone. Hayes gestured toward Sophia. This is Lieutenant Colonel Sophia Ramirez, Director of the Adaptive Leadership Initiative. Colonel Ramirez, this is Lieutenant Amelia Carter, formerly commander of Alpha Company, 87th Infantry. Recognition flickered across the young officer's face. The Adaptive Leadership Program. Sir, ma'am, we studied your case at West Point. You're the officer who saved General Hayes during the Fort Brennan floods. Sophia smiled, extending her hand. And you're the officer who evacuated 3 wounded soldiers under fire after losing your leg in the initial ambush. Your actions in the Panjshir Valley have similarly become required study. Lieutenant Carter's eyes widened slightly. You know about that? Of course, Sophia replied. Exceptional leadership deserves recognition, especially when it involves adaptation under the most extreme circumstances. What followed was a conversation that transcended rank and formality, 2 officers sharing insights from a journey few could understand. They discussed prosthetic techniques, phantom pain management, and the psychological challenges of redefining identity after life-altering injury. Throughout their conversation, Haas observed with quiet satisfaction, occasionally contributing his own more recent insights from his less severe but still significant injury. As they prepared to leave, Lieutenant Carter asked a question that revealed the true purpose of their visit. Ma'am, they're telling me my combat command days are over, that I should transition to support roles or consider medical retirement. Is that really the only path forward? The question hung in the air, laden with all the doubt and determination Sophia remembered from her own rehabilitation. Before responding, she glanced at Hayes, understanding now why he had arranged this meeting. Lieutenant, Sophia began carefully, there was a time when that was the standard pathway. When the military saw physical limitation as categorically disqualifying for combat leadership roles. She gestured toward herself and Hayes. What you see before you is evidence that pathway has changed. The question isn't whether you can return to exactly the role you had before. The question is what unique perspective your journey has given you that might actually enhance your leadership capability in ways your previous experience couldn't. Carter's expression shifted subtly, the first awakening of possibility where institutional messaging had suggested only limitation. The hardest adaptation isn't physical, Sophia continued. It's conceptual. It's recognizing that what appears to be limitation often contains the seed of new capability if approached with the right mindset. As they left Walter Reed, Hayes shared something he had never previously revealed. You know, when you saved me during that flood, it changed more than just my life expectancy. It changed my entire understanding of military capability. They walked through the hospital corridors, passing other wounded warriors engaged in their own battles of recovery and redefinition. I'd spent decades evaluating officers based on standardized metrics of physical performance and tactical execution. Hayes continued. Then suddenly, there you were, a lieutenant with one leg outperforming officers with 2 in the areas that actually mattered under crisis conditions. He stopped, turning to face her directly. It forced me to question every assumption I'd developed throughout my career about what makes an effective combat leader. If I had been wrong about that, what else had traditional military thinking miscalculated about capability and limitation? The conversation continued as they drove from Walter Reed to the Pentagon, exploring how personal experience with limitation had transformed their respective approaches to leadership development. What had begun as individual adaptation had evolved into institutional innovation that was reshaping military capability at the strategic level. Upon reaching the Pentagon, Hayes led Sophia to a secure briefing room where several senior officers and civilian advisors were already gathered. Unexpected meeting suggested something significant was developing. Colonel Ramirez, Hayes began formally. I've asked you here because the Joint Chiefs are forming a special advisory group to address emerging asymmetric threats that don't respond to conventional force application. Your experience with adaptive leadership under constraining conditions has particular relevance to this challenge. The briefing that followed outlined a series of complex international scenarios where traditional military approaches had proven ineffective, situations that demanded fundamentally new thinking about capability, limitation, and adaptive response. These threats can't be overcome through superior firepower or conventional dominance, explained the Deputy Director for Special Operations. They require leaders who excel precisely in the areas your initiative has been developing: adaptation to constraining conditions that neutralize traditional advantages. What Hayes was proposing went beyond advisory capacity. He was suggesting that the principles Sophia had helped develop for individual leadership should be applied to strategic military thinking at the institutional level, reshaping how America approached asymmetric conflicts altogether. The fundamental insight of your work, Hayes noted, is that adaptation to limitation often reveals capabilities that would remain undiscovered under ideal conditions. We need to apply that same principle to our strategic thinking about force application in constrained operational environments. The conversation continued for hours, ranging from tactical adaptation to strategic reimagining of how military power could be effectively applied in emerging conflict paradigms. Throughout the discussion, Sophia recognized how far the institution had evolved from the days when she had been mockingly called Hopper at Fort Brennan. That evening, following the strategic briefing, Hayes invited Sophia to join him and several senior officers for dinner at the Army-Navy Club in downtown Washington. The historic venue had been hosting military leaders since 1891, its wood-paneled dining room witnessing generations of strategic discussions and institutional evolution. As they enjoyed their meal, Hayes shared a perspective that revealed the true significance of Sophia's journey. "You know," he began thoughtfully, "military institutions typically evolve through one of two mechanisms: catastrophic failure that forces change, or visionary leadership that drives it proactively. What you've helped create represents something rare: evolutionary adaptation, driven by recognizing capability where others saw only limitation." Around the table, senior officers nodded in agreement. The Adaptive Leadership Initiative had transformed from a specialized program into a fundamental reassessment of how military capability was conceptualized, developed, and deployed. "The most significant insight," added General Maxwell, the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, "isn't just about accommodating wounded warriors. It's about recognizing that adaptation to limitation is actually the core capability we need in all our leaders, regardless of physical condition." The conversation eventually turned to Sophia's future. Her rapid rise from lieutenant to lieutenant colonel had been extraordinary, but the path forward offered even greater potential. Impact. "The Secretary is forming a special advisory group on next-generation warfare," Hayes mentioned casually. "Your name is at the top of his list for consideration." The opportunity represented unprecedented influence for an officer of her rank: direct advisory access to the senior-most civilian leadership of the military establishment. It also represented something more profound: institutional recognition that her journey from wounded warrior to leadership innovator had implications far beyond individual advancement. As dinner concluded, the gathered officers prepared to return to their respective commands and responsibilities. Before departing, Hayes shared a final observation that crystallized the significance of everything that had transpired since Fort Brennan. "You know, Sophia," he said, using her first name for the first time in their professional relationship, "what began as your personal journey to prove yourself has transformed how an entire institution understands itself. That's the rarest form of leadership, the kind that doesn't just excel within existing paradigms, but creates entirely new ones." The next morning brought a final symbolic milestone in Sophia's extraordinary journey. She had been invited to address the graduating class at West Point, the first officer with a complete limb amputation ever to receive this honor. As she prepared in her hotel room, reviewing her remarks one final time, Sophia reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. From the battlefield in Kandahar, where she had lost her leg, through rehabilitation at Walter Reed, to the leadership program at Fort Brennan, where she had been mockingly called Hopper, each challenge had revealed capabilities that might otherwise have remained undiscovered. Her phone chimed with an incoming message, a text from Lieutenant Carter at Walter Reed. "Ma'am, just received orders to the adaptive leadership cadre at Fort Benning. They're giving me a chance to shape training for the next generation. Thank you for showing the way." The message represented the completion of a cycle. The wounded warrior who had once fought to prove herself was now creating pathways for others to follow. Not merely accommodating their limitations, but recognizing the unique capabilities those limitations might reveal. At precisely 0900, Sophia Ramirez stepped onto the stage at West Point's graduation ceremony, facing 1,000 cadets preparing to begin their own journeys as military leaders. In the front row sat the Academy's senior leadership, including Lieutenant General Hayes and the Chief of Staff of the Army. "Leadership," she began, her voice carrying across the historic parade ground, "is not about performing flawlessly under ideal conditions. It's about adapting effectively when conditions fail catastrophically." As she spoke, Sophia moved away from the podium, allowing the assembled cadets to see her complete form, including the advanced prosthetic leg that had once marked her as different, but now symbolized everything she had come to represent. "Each of you will face moments when everything you've trained for proves insufficient, when the conditions you encounter render your prepared responses inadequate. In those moments, you'll discover that leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being adaptable when perfection fails." Throughout the audience, cadets listened with unusual intensity. Unlike many graduation speakers who offered abstract wisdom or institutional history, Sophia Ramirez embodied the very principles she described. Her presence on that stage, as a combat-wounded officer who had risen to extraordinary influence, demonstrated the practical reality of adaptation through limitation. "The greatest threats to mission success aren't external obstacles," she continued. "They're internal constraints, the conceptual limitations that prevent us from recognizing capability where conventional wisdom sees only deficiency." As she concluded her address, Sophia offered a final insight drawn directly from her personal journey. "The measure of your leadership won't be how perfectly you implement what you've learned here. It will be how effectively you create new approaches. When everything you've learned proves insufficient, that capacity for adaptation, for creating possibility where others see only limitation, is the true foundation of military leadership." The applause that followed wasn't merely ceremonial acknowledgement. It represented recognition that her journey from wounded warrior to doctrinal innovator had transformed institutional understanding of leadership itself. As Sophia left the stage, Hayes approached with a gesture she remembered from their first meeting after the flood emergency at Fort Brennan. The Lieutenant General rendered a crisp salute to the Lieutenant Colonel, an acknowledgement, not of rank but of the journey and transformation she represented. This time, however, he wasn't alone. The entire front row of military leadership followed his example, rising to honor not just Sophia Ramirez, but everything her presence on that stage symbolized about the evolution of military leadership. The ceremony concluded with the traditional Het Taz 1,000 cadets launching their caps skyward in celebration of their transition from students to commissioned officers. As Sophia watched, she recognized that each of those young leaders would enter service with a fundamentally different understanding of capability and limitation than her generation had received. Following the ceremony, a reception gathered senior leaders and distinguished guests in the historic Cullum Hall. As Sophia moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and engaging in conversations about the future of military leadership, she was approached by a cadet who had lingered after graduation. "Colonel Ramirez," the young woman began hesitantly, "I wanted to thank you personally. Your journey's the reason I'm standing here today." The cadet gestured discreetly toward her uniform pants, where a slight bulge suggested a prosthetic or medical device of some kind. "Bone cancer at 16. They told me a military career was impossible. Then I read about the officer they called Hopper, who ended up transforming how the entire military thinks about leadership capability. The moment crystallized everything Sophia's journey had come to represent, not merely personal achievement against adversity, but institutional transformation that created pathways for others to follow. "What was your name again, Lieutenant?" Sophia asked warmly. "Martinez, ma'am. Isabella Martinez." The coincidence of their shared surname brought a smile to Sophia's face. "Well, Lieutenant Martinez, it seems we have more than a name in common. We both understand something crucial about leadership that many officers spend entire careers without discovering." "What's that, ma'am?" "That our greatest capabilities often emerge from our most difficult limitations, but only when we stop trying to hide those limitations and start exploring what unique perspectives they might reveal." As they parted ways, Sophia watched the newly commissioned lieutenant move confidently through the reception, her slight limp barely noticeable but symbolically significant. Another generation of leadership was emerging, one that understood adaptation not as accommodation to limitation, but as discovery of new capability. Later that evening, as Sophia prepared to return to the Pentagon for her ongoing work with the Strategic Advisory Group, she received an unexpected package delivered to her hotel room. Inside was a simple shadow box containing 2 items: a Medal of Honor, ribbon clearly from Heiss's personal collection, and a small brass plate with an inscription, "To Lieutenant Colonel Sophia Ramirez, whose journey taught us that true leadership isn't measured by performance under ideal conditions, but by adaptation when those conditions fail. With profound respect and gratitude, Lt. Gen. Michael Hayes, Medal of Honor." The gesture represented something beyond personal acknowledgement. It symbolized institutional recognition that her journey from wounded warrior to doctrinal innovator had transformed how the military understood leadership itself. As Sophia placed the shadow box in her luggage, she reflected on the extraordinary path that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as a personal mission to prove herself despite physical limitation had evolved into something far more significant, a fundamental reassessment of how military capability was identified, developed, and deployed. The woman they had mockingly called Hopper had not merely overcome adversity to achieve individual success. She had transformed how an entire institution understood the relationship between limitation and capability, between standardization and adaptation, between physical perfection and leadership effectiveness. As she prepared for the strategic meetings that awaited her at the Pentagon, Sophia Ramirez recognized that her journey had never truly been about proving others wrong. It had been about revealing capabilities that might have remained undiscovered, without the very limitation that had initially marked her as different. The road ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities to demonstrate that adaptation wasn't merely about overcoming limitation. It was about recognizing that our greatest strengths often emerge from the very challenges that seem most likely to defeat us. The lieutenant they had mocked for her missing leg had ultimately stood tall enough for a Medal of Honor recipient to rise and salute her, not despite her prosthetic, but because of everything it had taught her, and through her, an entire institution. About the true nature of leadership in an increasingly complex and unpredictable world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.